Welcome to Unlocked, the home of common sense that speaks Britain's language. From the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, Unlocked was the first media platform to kick back against the government's punitive lockdown. We were told to stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives, and we did. But our experts argued that this had the unintended consequences of decimating the economy and creating a public health crisis of unprecedented proportions. Yet despite all of this, by a majority of 516 to 38 this afternoon, 415 years and 1 day after Guy Fawkes failed to light a powder keg under the government, today our MPs made a bonfire of our hopes of a return to normality. At midnight tonight, England will again be plunged into a second month-long COVID-19 lockdown. It's the nightmare before Christmas. To discuss this and more, tonight we have a special edition of Unlocked, highlighting the launch last week of the Recovery Group, a collective of globally renowned experts in the field of oncology, mental health, law, business, and journalism. Today, our guests will be making the case that quite simply, lockdowns don't work. Joining us tonight will be oncologist Professor Karol Sikora, psychologist Emma Kenny, and broadcaster Sue Cook. But our first two guests are two of Recovery's founders, John Dobinson and Alan Miller. First, John, why did you form Recovery and what do you hope to achieve?
Well, I mean, it's been an extraordinary journey, really, because it was only in September that we got together as a small group of friends and said, what's happening in this country is wrong. I'd been through the first lockdown. I didn't think then that it was the right move, but I was prepared to go along with it. And it rapidly became clear that the first lockdown really didn't achieve anything beyond a lot of damage and destruction. We can see now that the same problems, the same conversations, the same predictions of inflated deaths are being made that were then. So if the first lockdown had worked, surely now we'd be in a position where we could be looking at what we're aiming for, which is recovery. But all it seems to have done is exactly what the experts said it would do, which is postpone the problem, not fix it. So we've postponed the problem. We've now got it back again. We're now having the same solution again. And the trouble is, it's going to create the same destruction again, because the destruction of the first one, according to the government's own figures, was off the scale. I mean, terrible in terms of the economy, terrible in terms of the damage it did to people's lives, terrible in terms of mental health. But this crisis is described by the government purely and simply in terms of mortality. And if we look at mortality, the government says 200,000 people died of that first lockdown, by all unnecessary deaths due to cancers not being treated, due to mental health, due to the impact of unemployment on people's lives, 200,000 people. And this time we've rushed into a lockdown and the government hasn't even bothered to calculate the damage. So when I say, why did we start Recovery? We started Recovery because it was desperately important to do something about this, to fix what's going wrong. The government is behaving in an extraordinarily irresponsible manner, and somebody's got to stand up and say, hang on a minute, think again, stop. You and others have done superb work, but the problem we could see is that no one was pulling everybody together into a coalition to oppose this. We had isolated voices who are experts in one area or another, but no one working with everyone together in the way that the government voice, the fear that is broadcast into people's homes, is united. And we need to be united on our side and speak with one voice, have one coalition that brings everybody together to say there's a better way and we've got to take it before more damage is done.
Well, hear to that. I mean, it's amazing and brilliant to see these kind of groups forming. It's been a long time coming and you've had an immediate impact. I mean, here's the front of the Daily Mail on Monday, and it quite simply says, as tonight's show is indicated, lockdowns don't work, a superb stunt. That was broadcast onto the side of the Houses of Parliament. It made the front page of the Daily Mail. And may I say, it's great to see the Daily Mail taking a stand against this. It's been a long time coming, since those dark days of the lockdown, when all of the mainstream media, and I want to talk to Sue Cook about this in a bit, all of the mainstream media felt like the propaganda wing of the government. So, Alan, in terms of this epic arrival, you've grabbed the nation's headlines. Can you explain to us from midnight why you think the lockdown won't work?
Absolutely. Well, it's an essential problem. And we've seen before already that lockdowns don't work. In fact, they just make everything worse. We know from the point of view of actually treating the virus at whatever level of seriousness it is, it does not actually resolve that issue and that question. But at the same time, simultaneously, we have a series of different detrimental impacts. We see that patients of a range of other areas are not being treated properly or seen. We know that people are scared to go to hospitals and also to be treated, whether that's cancer, whether that's to do with strokes, heart disease, pre and postnatal, and a range of mental health issues. We know that isolation and anxiety impact every demographic in Britain, from those that are elderly generation are living on their own, to families and children as well, in a really significant way. We know that when we suffocate the economy and the ability both on a social level for people to interact on a daily basis, but also economically, we're not able to drive through and come up with new innovations and a dynamic to solve things. So in every respect, what we end up doing is we don't even kick the can down the road. What we do is we really punish all of our citizens, our businesses that are being forced into foreclosures, the millions of people who are economically finding it more difficult. And we know that both the UN, the World Health Organization, and others have all now pointed out that when lockdowns occur, they specifically punish people with less income and at the poorer spectrum. So in every respect, lockdowns don't work. And what we need to see is some courage and conviction for people to say, actually, we need to come out of this needs to be changed.
Well, I mean, here again to that. And, it's just amazing. I've been saying for a long time, I want to put this question to you guys now. Don't you think that the loudest trumpet blowers of the lockdown have been handsomely paid journalists, politicians who will never lose their livelihoods, the comfortably furloughed, those happily working from home, public sector workers, the retired, and actually those who've been hit the hardest, the working classes, the grassroots? They've been denied a voice throughout all of this process, and mercifully, Recovery and Unlocked is giving a voice to those people. Is it fair to say that those who've been hit the hardest are not getting the voice, and those who are happy with it are just shouting the loudest about it?
Well, I want to just to say one thing on that, because there are 5 reasonable demands. The first one is behave with humanity. And it is the case that there are a variety of views, and some people are very scared, and there has been some very shrill discourse. And I think that it's a real problem that an excuse for debating ideas and thinking about them and challenging principles often can result in people slurring or accusing people. So I think the aspiration is to debate openly and honestly, but also it's the case that absolutely that it's the case that people that are in a disproportionately poor position are the most affected. And effectively what we want to do with this is to encourage a whole new tenor and temper of debate, to be able to engage and discuss with things that people don't agree, but in a civil way and in a way that's open. Because at the end, we've forgotten we're all in this together. What happened to the idea that we're all citizens, neighbours, families and friends? And just this evening, people may have seen, but there's been a young woman was filming her mother, who's a nurse, who was just arrested for taking her 97-year-old grandmother, who they'd not had with them for 9 months. They wanted to take her into her home. And the police arrested the mother, who's a nurse, and the 97-year-old grandmother. And you just think, what's happening in Britain? What does this lockdown mean? Who is deciding that this is the correct, civil, decent way to behave? Terrifying. And it's in that context, I think, on the one hand, behave with humanity, but also in the discussion, people are going to have different views, but let's have an open, honest discourse and debate. Let's not slur people. We're taking the high road. We think that the truth will out and that we can convince people on that point of view of our fellow citizens and family and friends.
It's a great point, well made, Alan. And I've been saying for a long time, and I know others have on this call tonight, that we can't just win this debate through data and graphs and charts. We have to tell these human stories, don't we? Of lives turned around, of lives decimated, of the inhumanity of these lockdowns. So, John, can I cut back to you and ask you about something I think else is really important? And I noticed, Emma Kenny, I want to come to you in a minute. You gave a sensational speech at the launch of Recovery. And one thing that I could sense, and I've known you for a long time, I just love you to bits, is this is risky, isn't it? It's risky to talk about these things. There's potential reputational damage. There's potential friendship, career damage through taking a stance against the lockdown. John, is that a prevalent point?
I mean, I think it's something I talked about when we launched Recovery, and it's something that was in my mind in standing up and being at the forefront of this. Is that what we call the fear and smear brigade are out there, and they have two tactics. One is to generate fear. The other is to smear anybody who stands up against them. And we can see what the fear is doing to mental health. We can see what the fear is doing to people's lives. And actually, when we talk about the victims of this crisis, as you just did, I don't just think the victims are the people who are losing their jobs. I mean, for me, the victims include some of those who are most scared, most convinced the lockdown is the right thing to do. I think of that elderly man or woman or couple cowering in their homes, only hearing about this through the TV, not daring to let anybody through their door, staying on their own for months on end, being terrified, living the last years or the last months of their life in the most appalling hell of their own, of the creation, really, of this campaign of fear. And to me, those people think lockdown's a good thing, but they are the victims of this just as much as the people who are losing their jobs. And I think we should remember that this extraordinary campaign of fear that's been waged, the people who support it are actually, in many cases, the biggest victims of it. But to come back to your question, when we talk about these sorts of issues, what we see from the other side is what looks like an extraordinarily organized campaign. I'm someone who's conducted political campaigns before. Years ago, I was Secretary General of the International Society for Human Rights, and ever since those days, I've involved myself in political campaigns from time to time, and I've become reasonably sophisticated in knowing what they look like and how they work. And what I see on the other side of this is one of the most ruthlessly organized and executed political campaigns I've ever seen. I've got no idea who's behind it or why they're doing it, but there's no doubt about what it is. And one of their key tactics is whenever anybody stands up, they do everything they can to intimidate them and shut them up. And a lot of people, some very, very important voices have been shut out of this debate because they're simply scared of speaking out. For example, we have a very large number of NHS workers, including many senior doctors, who are coming to us and are keen to be involved in the cause, but are saying, if we actually talk publicly about what's going on in hospitals, about what the situation genuinely is on the ground, we'll lose our jobs. So we want to tell you what's going on, but we can't actually say what's going on ourselves. And the danger of that is the government is taking actions now which are colossally damaging. And yet it is refusing to allow an open debate. We have broadcasting rules, which means the truth can't be broadcast on TV, or at least the questions can't be debated. And its approach, as we've just seen, the statistics it presented to Parliament today as the justification for a lockdown, the case pretty much crumbled before the vote today. And yet, without an open debate, we can't actually put forward better ideas or better ways. It's a very, very troubling situation.
There have been so many times during this lockdown where I've believed that I don't recognize Britain anymore. I don't recognize what the media has become. I don't recognize how people have been empowered to snoop and to snitch and to make enemies of comrades and friends, to attack them simply for their view. It's making Brexit look like a tea party. And I say that as somebody who was actively involved in the Brexit campaign. We seem to have a terribly severe new battlefront. Now, We had 80,000 views of this trailer before the show. It's going mad. And I think that's because people really, really want to hear these sort of conversations. They've been stifled until now. And please get involved on the hashtag Time for Recovery. That's FOR Recovery, Time for Recovery, on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter. And send us your stories. If you have a story that you want to share about how your life has been impacted in a draconian way, or even stories of hope and beautiful coming together, get involved. We want to tell your stories. Let's make this a forum where we can share and find strength and build that resolve that we need, because we've got a dark month coming ahead. I'm going to move on now, if I can, to our next guest, hopefully minus the dancer, Professor Karol Sikora, of course, an old friend of Unlock's, an oncologist of 50 years, and a positive professor who since the very beginning has been a voice of reason, a voice of hope. Professor Sikora, when we last spoke on Unlock's back in July, you stated the powerful words that the government had brainwashed and terrified the nation into staying at home and even putting off life-saving care. Do you think that position still stands today?
I think it's more so. I think what we're seeing now is the careful manipulation of data to show what it wants to show. You know, bad scientists take a conclusion and then get the data they've got and use it to fit that conclusion. And that's what we're seeing now. The problem with lockdown is, we've heard it from John and from Alan, you're kicking the can down the road. On December 2nd, when we come out of this, what's going to change? Nothing. The R factor will go up and we'll be back where we were. The only single reason for an effective lockdown is if the NHS gets swamped, that it just can't cope. Now, all the data point that it will be all right. And you're right about my colleagues. They're not speaking up. They say, Karol, we haven't got our pensions. You have, and you work now for the private sector. You're not dependent on the NHS anymore. We are, and we've been warned. If we speak out to say the ICUs are not full, there's really no pressure, everything is returning back to normal. It was much worse a couple of years ago in the winter at this time, when older people come in with the usual chest infections. We call it winter pressures. So, and they're being suppressed. They're not being told. So you're right. There's some organization that's controlling everybody's mindset. So brainwashing is it. And I'm sure we're going to see some posters everywhere tomorrow about protecting the NHS again. The NHS is for us. It's not that we have to protect the NHS. It has to protect us. But let's give you 6 reasons why I think lockdown's a bad idea. And I know Emma will concentrate on one of them, which I really think is the biggest one, mental health. The first one is it doesn't solve anything. It just delays the inevitable. You move forward 4 weeks and you're in exactly the same position. The second thing is the NHS coping. Yes, it is. Now, the problem is what we saw in the last lockdown is a complete shutdown of all sorts of services, cancer diagnostic services, stroke services. And amazingly to me, the number of people presenting to emergency departments with heart attacks dropped by 45%. Now, that wasn't the hospital's fault. It wasn't the emergency room's fault. They were open for people with what we call myocardial infarction, when the coronary vessels get blocked suddenly. And unless they're unblocked quickly using a stent, you get damage to the heart muscle, and people then later go into cardiac failure, maybe several years later. So basically, how could it be that nearly half the heart attack patients didn't come because they'd been brainwashed, clearly? We can't afford for that to happen again. Another tranche of people through the month of November not receiving proper care for their heart disease, their stroke, and their cancer. It's a delicate balancing act, and I fully understand that if it is going to get swamped with COVID, we're going to have to go into a lockdown. But the data don't show that. And I just can't understand it. And when you look at the people like Carl Hennigan and others that have analyzed the data, they come out with a different conclusion. And we see it on Twitter all the time. Someone is controlling the data and being selective. So lockdown kicks the can. NHS is doing all right. Cancer, heart attacks, and strokes will suffer because people will be brainwashed again. Emma will talk about mental health. you know, what are we to do? I'm so depressed when I get up in the morning. I'm cheerful. I'm the positive professor, for goodness sake. And here I am thinking, oh no, what are we going to do now? I can see the problems. I get tense with everybody. The fifth reason for not liking lockdowns is, who does it affect? And we've heard that from John at the beginning. It makes poor people poorer. And there's no doubt, it doesn't affect the middle class, the professionals, public sector workers, nice pensions, retirees, people that live on their own, that have finished it, they've paid off their mortgage, they've got their big pension, the kids all got a free education, the house price went up tenfold at least over the last 30 years, and they're sitting so comfortably. And they're very frightened, of course. And that's part of the problem. They won't come forward to hospital. And then the final reason you could justify lockdown is a vaccine. And I'm sure the skilled PR communication gurus at Number 10 put out that stuff of a vaccine before Christmas. Tell the GPs to prepare for the vaccine. I've never seen a GP actually give a shot of a vaccine. Have you ever had a shot of any vaccine from a GP? Of course not. It comes from not even the nurses. Healthcare assistants do it. Pharmacists do it. You don't need GPs to do it. They're not the coordinators of it. And in fact, I had my flu jab last week. I went to the supermarket to get it. Efficient, timely, and no problem. So it seems to me that if you're using lockdown to wait for a vaccine, you've got problems. The vaccine business, it's a huge billion-dollar investment. You know, the chairman of all the world's big pharma are vying with each other to get the first vaccine approved. I don't think it'll be approved before Christmas. Besides the headlines in the Daily Express today, it's not going to be approved that quickly. There are downsides to it. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it never happened for SARS, and that was in 2003. It burnt itself out before the vaccine became available, and it's still not really there. MERS, exactly the same. Even the flu, which we all, us old people, get vaccinated for, it's not totally effective. There's all sorts of reasons for that. So doing lockdown just to wait for the vaccine, to give us a fire break, as the Welsh call it, to wait for the vaccine is not a good thing. It may not come till summer, and then the logistics of giving it, and you really want to give it to the over 85s first? This seems just craziness. And the final thought I'll leave you with is that it's not about, for me, it's not about health versus wealth. It's health versus health. You do a lockdown, other people will die in that lockdown because they won't or can't seek medical aid. And if you look at the life years lost with COVID, because the average age of death from COVID is over 82, which is roughly the normal longevity in Britain, it means that if you leave cancer and heart disease patients, just those, you'll lose a lot more lives because their potential life, because they're younger, is much greater. And it's not just the absolute number of deaths, it's the longevity of the death that you have to compare. And we've done an analysis now on cancer versus COVID, and it's quite staggering to see the figures of how many COVID patients you have to save. If you save a COVID patient, how many cancer patients die unless you can do something miraculous with the service. So huge challenges for everybody. You know, being positive, we will get through this. It's not going to be a great Christmas, I don't think. And in the new year, we'll see some change and improvement. But I'm just so sad for the poor people on the gig economy and so on, because they're not going to come out of this well and healthy at all. And of course, although I talk about health versus health as the key priority, there is a connection between health and wealth. You make people poor, you make them ill, and there's nothing you can do about it. And obviously, you make them ill in the head as well. It's depressing to worry about it, and that's where we are. So getting us out of lockdown, I think, is really important as quickly as possible, not December 2nd. Let's review the data, and if it's doing well, let's get out early. Thank you.
And you're right about the data. I mean, look at the data that we had yesterday. The R rate is below 1. There's no need for a lockdown. Today, you mentioned Professor Karol Hennigan saying that the ICU is running at seasonal norm. There's a 5-year trend, 15% spare capacity. There is no need for a lockdown. And then I'm no conspiracy theorist, but suddenly just before a key vote, the coronavirus alert is ratcheted up to the highest alert level possible. We're all going around like headless chickens again, and it seems to be based on fear and propaganda and not data. Like I say, I'm no conspiracy theorist. Get involved on the hashtag Time for Recovery if you can. Tell us your stories. And a quick reminder to all of tonight's panelists at the end of the show, after Emma and Sue, I hope you can stick around, Professor Sikora. I want you to give me your messages for Boris Johnson. What would you like to say to Boris Johnson? Because we're going to make sure he gets them. We know number 10 watch unlocked, because last week we were outraged about Boris Johnson cancelling Remembrance Sunday services. We went off the dial, we got veterans involved, and number 10 changed their mind. A victory for common sense, a victory for patriotic Britons, and we're going to make sure number 10 hear about this show tonight. Moving swiftly onwards, Emma Kenny, another co-founder of Recovery, TV psychologist, best known for her work on ITV This Morning, where our eyes locked on a sofa years ago, Emma, when we worked together doing the news review. A long-term admirer of yours. And I've just got to say again, when you gave your speech at the Recovery launch last week, I thought it was a speech of your life. I thought you spoke from the heart. I thought you brought humanity to this, which I think we really need. As I keep saying, it cannot be won on data and evidence and pie charts and graphs and PowerPoint alone. The public are fed up with that. We need to understand the impact. And of course, your specialist topic area is the mental health impact of the COVID lockdown and the unemployment and the knock-on effects. So how can you best encapsulate the sheer damage that's been caused by this, Emma?
I mean, where do I begin? It's one of those situations that I never thought I'd face in my lifetime, because as a linear and logical thinker, which a lot of therapists and psychologists are, we like data, but we also like things to make sense. The chaos that has been created since day one has been unfathomably huge and continues to be the same. And just to put this in context, when we talk about people having a voice, and I think what I've heard from the discussion today, as people have said, the psychological impact, the fear mongering, the traumatization that has occurred through the constant 24-hour pumping into our communities, this idea that coronavirus is going to kill so many of us. And it's needed that because evidently they haven't had enough deaths to prove that particular position. So they've had to continue pumping that into our communities. And on one hand, you've got some who are afraid. And I say some because there will be some people traumatized and terrified, but Professor Karol is correct, as John is correct. There will also be a lot of people who actually have had stressful lives, and this has been a year off, and they've been paid to do that. Why would they, when they look at their own lives, be doing what I'm doing and what these guys are doing, which is putting ourselves on a line for people who don't have a voice? And when I say they don't have a voice, I mean 30 million people have pay-as-you-go phones with very limited data. They aren't on Twitter. They aren't taking part in YouGov votes. And so too are the 1.9 million homes who don't have any internet connection. These are the poorest and most marginalized. So when we talk about mental health, and then we talk about poverty and disease, which Professor Karol will be even more qualified to comment on, what we know is that when you are somebody who's living in poverty, you tend to live about 10 years younger than you would do if you had the luxury of being affluent. So you're not even going to get in the ballpark of a coronavirus death average. And that's problematic because not only do these people get mostly affected by restrictions and lockdown, they don't even have a voice to complain about it. And then what we have is a very clear narrative by, shall we say, certain spokespeople with a very big good morning following, who seem to feel that the appropriate way to deal with people questioning a narrative is to use terms like COVIDiots. So we marginalize individuals who choose to go against a narrative. Now, the problem there is when you turn down a voice of the populace, and this is the populace, this isn't a few people wanting restrictions to end for the right reasons. This is because we see the catastrophic impact on mental health, on education, and on the structure of our economy as we know it, i.e. creatives. Creatives and entrepreneurs are often quite poor. You know, I'm somebody who's had a startup. you don't have a lot of money, therefore you need your economy to continue, and they're getting shut down left, right and centre. So we're losing creative thought. We have theatres and all of those individuals who spent their entire lives training to do something they love being told to retrain. The mental health in our environment democratically is desecrated, because on every single level, unless you are a public service worker, you're not going to have been in a position of strength. Add to that the impact of poverty and disease, you're not going to be feeling healthy and happy. On top of that, just think about the impact on poverty in children. These children, the future, they divide-wise have gone from being in a position where they were already using food banks, because those kids tend to have parents who are working, by the way, to all those people listening who seem to think that poverty is caused by parents who go out of their way to just spend money on alcohol and cigarettes, which is evidently in all the research and data not true. They were going to food banks before, and we have never used them as much as we do today. So we have this ridiculous scenario where the very people that we should be seeking to protect, the poor and vulnerable and children, we've done the absolute opposite with. And my bigger question really, if you're thinking about the wider picture, is you've desensitized masses of the population. They're not COVIDiots. They didn't see the evidence. The bodies weren't there. They weren't enough. No matter how much you pump into it, you can't create it. So you've desensitized them. They're not afraid anymore. Why should they be? They're humans. They're animals. They need social support, social contact. They need to feel the breath and love of loved ones that they've been kept from. On the other side, you have a minority of people terrified. And then somewhere in between, you have the wider, bigger voice. Those with internet connection, those with jobs who are furloughed, those with individual situations where they can work technologically from home without a problem, not having to go to the commute. There is a reason why they have the bigger voice, and there's a reason why often the polls are completely incorrect. So for me, on a mental health level, every single area has been impacted on our society. Suicide's through the roof, self-harm's gone through the roof, suicidal ideation is through the roof, anxiety's through the roof, depression's through the roof, but more than anything, we have fundamentally failed children on the safeguarding level. Safeguarding is there to protect the most vulnerable from harm, abuse, and neglect. The government is the biggest gaslighter, coercive controller, and absolute abuser of our children. And for me, I sit in horror that we are accepting this on any level. And I come from a working class background. I'm probably the least academic of everybody here. So I come from a place where maybe my perspective is for my common working man and woman, because I know that they haven't got the voice they deserve.
Well, Emma, I mean, not for the first time. Oh, sorry. We're only human.
No, I'm glad that you are human, because it's not what's happening. And you're right, ask the question, how dare the media in the UK, how dare they have colluded with the government to distress and completely contaminate our communities with hate, division and lies? Because that, I'm fortunate in knowing that I will hopefully be alive in 10 years, because I'll remind them every day of the week for the rest of their lives of what they did.
Well, I'll tell you what, Emma for number 10 is what I'm saying. I mean,
I'd never do that. I'd spend my life depressed.
If only you were inside that bloody parliament tonight, we might have had some common sense. And rather
at least I'd care. At least I'd care.
Rather than going off, bad data, bad science, fear and paranoia, you're speaking from the
lies.
Heart. You're from the same community that I'm from. I'm a coal miner's son. We were demonized by Brexit. We've been demonized over COVID, and no one's given them a voice. Immediate feedback I got here, and I want to talk to you so much more about the impact on children, because I've got a personal story on that front. And an immediate response here, Sean Leake, who's watching live on Facebook. Hi, Sean. I hope you're keeping well, mate. Saying to you, Emma, my mental health has been smashed by this bloody lockdown, because I've lost my job and I can't see my future anymore, and I'm worrying that I can't provide. And I hear it so often, this financial implication. As you know, Emma, I did a lot of work before on the mental health of men and boys, and this feeling of being a failure, of not being able to provide for your family, which is caused by the lockdown, especially amongst the working classes and the lower skilled. This is real.
this is absolutely real. And what really distresses me is you actually have people coming out and saying that these people should just accept it, just get on with it. It's only going to be a temporary situation. You tell that to a person who's losing their home. You tell that to somebody who can't feed their children. This has been an extraordinary amount of time where if you have, then fine, I get it. I even have empathy and sympathy with you. Who wouldn't like this amount of time off? And in fact, there are lots of people who don't think it's okay, by the way. So I'm not saying that everybody's in that category, but I have never seen the UK as selfish as it has been right now. We have horrific evidence that exponentially for the next decades and decades, our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will suffer because of this. And it's stunning to me that we are accepting it. It is stunning. And it's time that people woke up and started holding this government to account, because they have become a dictatorship. And how dare they? How dare they?
Wow. I want to talk now about the impact on children's mental health. Again, anybody out there who can watch Emma's launch speech at the Recovery Project last week, it was stunning. And you talked about children being damaged. Now, my son, who's 11, the lockdown was fun for us. You know, Daddy was at home, we were doing DIY, the sun was out. You know, they were the early days of the lockdown, and here we go now into a gloomier winter. And I had a text message literally as we came in telling me, this is a reminder that all students, he's 11, he's year 7, it's now compulsory to wear a face mask when they arrive at school tomorrow. This is a legal requirement, and they should be worn. And they've been told at my boys' school, if they don't wear it, they get detention. And my kid was crying his eyes out the other night. And I think this is not right.
It isn't right. And it isn't right because evidently they don't need to be wearing those masks. And as much as there are lots of different reports and studies coming out to support the wearing of masks, of course there are always studies when people are paid to do them. Equally, we can cite lots of studies that go completely against it. Developmentally, let me tell you, children require to see the micro expressions on people's faces. It's how they formulate empathy, their compassion. It's how they develop their communication. It is about enabling them to have a grown and full experience of childhood. How dare we be making them afraid of loving other people or seeing other people and talking to other people? How dare we steal from them their communication? I'm dyslexic, for example. Believe me, mouth movements matter. I don't wear one. I have asthma and I wear my disability badge because I'm not going to do it. And I would suggest that any school that is going against the opportunity for a child with mental health issues to actually not wear a mask is contravening their human rights. I'm working with lots of different psychologists at the moment. We've done an open letter to government with psychologycounts.com. Lots and lots of people, thousands signing because they are so against. We actually talk about masks in that. We've come out and gone against the narrative. It's unpopular to do that. They get a lot of trouble for it. But we know that what matters most is our children's happiness. How dare we be compromising it? One, they're uncomfortable. Secondly, they're scary. Most importantly, they refuse to allow you to have the developmental goals that you should be having as a child. And finally, we are forcing something completely unnecessary on children who don't get sick. This is the first time in history we have quarantined healthy people and made healthy people afraid to live. It's reprehensible.
An outstanding conversation, and we're getting so many Facebook comments. We could go through these all night, but please get involved, everybody. We promise you, we'll go through all of these comments after the show. We'll try and reply to you. We'll try and get you connected, however you are wanting to get involved. Use the hashtag #Time4Recovery. Let's get a conversation going on out there. Mention T4 at T4 Recovery on Twitter. We are at unlocked_UK_. Now, Emma, a couple of quick points to wrap up. I could talk to you all year, trust me. Actually, it'd be quite a nice way to spend the next month of bloody lockdown.
Yeah.
Have a good show like this. But look,
definitely.
2 things. First of all, I want to know a bit more about this open letter you sent this week. Yourself and 41 other mental health experts wrote to the government. Tell us about who's involved, what the letter said, and what you hope to achieve.
So we've got together as a group. Believe me, we weren't friends before. This has come from me and a few others connecting and then engaging in this and then developing it and speaking to brave professionals. It's very hard when you're a psychologist or a registered psychological therapist or somebody working in mental health to speak out, because often you might be employed by the NHS. But the reality is we cannot stand by and let this unfurl any further, because we know what's happening. The fact that children are killing themselves. What will be said by people listening now is, well, how do you have the evidence of that? Because of course, coroners' courts take between 6 and 12 months, sometimes even longer, to validate that. But we know, because we know when a child is found in non-suspicious circumstances dead, and there is a potential idea that it was suicide, that it's happening because it's been written in the papers. We can see anecdotally there are huge amounts of increases in these areas. We need to do something, because if not, what can we say about ourselves as practitioners? That letter has been written by people who know that in 5 or 10 years' time, we have to look in the mirror at ourselves and say that we did the best for the people that we cared most for, the vulnerable. And right now, anybody who is not doing that, it blows my mind. I sit every day, I look at my own children going into their final year of A-levels and their final year of GCSEs. They've not had any education. They've been sent home every week for 2 weeks because somebody tested positive somewhere near them 300 times. You know, that's what happens. And my kids went to state school because I believe in state education. And now I think they're probably going to do really badly. How many other people are going to be in that situation? So we know the catastrophic impact on education, on mental health and wellness, on family dynamics, on abuse, on homicide. You know, domestic homicide has gone from 3 women dying a week to 5 women dying a week. They're the children of those kind of victims. So the reason we've got together is we need to get it across to people out there that no more. We need to get back to normal. Restrictions are killing people. They are unnecessary. And we need our children to be returned their childhood, because we live in a democracy and we are autonomous human beings, and because we deserve to give our children the best. They need to survive and thrive. And right now, that's being compromised on every level.
And again, this is the article, your letter is in today's, Monday's Daily Mail, new mental health alert. So again, you know, hats off to the Mail. They're actually getting on a front foot.
They're amazing.
These conversations. Now, Emma, there's one particularly moving point of this article today, and would you mind sharing the story? It's really hard to talk about, but it's of somebody who sent a letter to you at ITV this morning. Please share this story, because we need some humanity out there. Can you tell us what happened?
So I was sent a suicide note of an individual who'd taken her life. I was letter 9. She's the mother of a 7-year-old child, and lockdown specifically was in the letter. She said that she couldn't carry on. The fear had got to her too much. She couldn't manage another lockdown, and she decided to take her own life. Listened to rainwater, she said, as she was dying. And as she was dying, she would just lay and wrote those letters, to 20 letters to different people. And I was letter 9. So that child is waking up without a mother every single day because of lockdown. But that's not the only one. You know, I've personally had 3 different people get in contact about their children under 16 who've killed themselves. This is constant every day. There are mothers and fathers dying. I had a parent separately from this. 4 children she had, missed all her treatment on the NHS for brain cancer, died 2 weeks ago. This is a constant in our lives. And I'm tired of being told that a COVID death has more worth than a suicide or a cancer death. When did we start putting value on life in that way? Life is life, it's precious. But for me, the most precious life is children, without a doubt.
You know, we get so many comments on Facebook. I want to read a couple out. People are saying here, the members of Parliament, our MPs need to be reminded that they work for us. They work for us. They don't dictate to us. And somebody else here is saying, politicians are quite simply making healthy people sick. Emma, this is exactly what you've been saying. It's so brave what you've been saying. Look, I think you're absolutely outstanding. Please, can we make more shows on Unlocked around this? I honestly think you can be the Joe Wicks of mental health for the United Kingdom. You know, I honestly think Britain needs you. And I'm not just blowing smoke.
I'd like to be the well, I mean, I get to do this morning, and they've been amazing with me. They're amazing this morning with respect to them. Like, they let me be the agony aunt in spite of my very loud views.
Well, look, the louder the better. As I said, you know, if we could bottle you and put you through the air conditioning at number 10, you know, we might get some common sense in there. Now, before we move on to Sue Cook, who's patiently sat there listening to all of this, I want to remind you, A, to get involved on the hashtag Time for Recovery, and secondly, all of you guys, think about your message for Boris Johnson, because we're going to make sure they get hand-delivered, social media bombed. We're going to write to them individually. We're going to make sure they listen to this show, to the general public, and to all of you guys tonight. Final guest, our headline act, our Rod Stewart, as it were, Sue Cook, veteran broadcaster, legend, you know, grown up watching you. It's an honor and a privilege to have you on the show. And I've got to say, a wonderfully surprising voice that entered this debate. And I've been a journalist for 25 years. You've obviously been going a lot longer than that. And what I wanted to talk to you about, Sue, tonight was this feeling we touched upon earlier in the show on Unlocked Tonight. This feeling that journalism seems to have changed. And whereas, and you've written about this passionately, whereas before rigor and process and analysis was applied, now journalists seem to be increasingly little more than mouthpieces for the government.
It's the thing that shocked me most in this whole shocking year or 8 months so far that we've had. And just listening to Emma painting those pictures of the terrible situations that people have been put in by what's these restrictions that we've been suffering. And what shocked me so much is, where's the media? Where are the questions? So many questions we all want to know the answer to. I mean, for example, we're all being guided by this company, these people called Sage. Who are these people called Sage? Right from the start, I've wanted to know, who the hell is Sage? Who's on these? What sort of people are they? What are their skills? What's their expertise? How does the whole process work? You know, do they meet once a week? Do they meet once a month? Do they send memos to each other? Wouldn't it be nice if the media would find out exactly how that works? The testing, all these restrictions are based on the PCR test, the polymerase chain reaction test, for which it would seem there is a very high rate of false positives. But if you try and tell somebody that, you know, or discuss it with somebody, they say, oh no, that can't be true. Or other people think, yes, it's absolutely outrageous. Wouldn't it be nice if the mainstream media went out and did a proper investigation about the tests? Let's go into the laboratories. Let's maybe find some insiders who tell us exactly how it works, how much, by how much it's magnified, because apparently it's not standardized. And so many people are getting many false positives. I know one person who's had 7 false positives, but I want to see the investigations. I want to see the BBC of old out there doing investigations. I want to go into hospitals and talk about, are they really overwhelmed? We hear that actually the ICU beds are standard for this time of year, but you wouldn't think that listening to Balance and Whitty and Boris in his press conference last. It's just there are so many questions, and the BBC of old would have questioned, would have challenged, we'd have seen features, we'd have seen investigations, we'd have got an idea, we'd have heard from this person and we'd have heard from that person. We never hear from people like Carl Hennigan, or very rarely on the BBC, people who offer alternative opinions. I don't think we hear from Karol very much. We hear from Neil Ferguson so often, who's so discredited. But do we ever hear that he's been discredited by any journalist on the BBC? Anybody questioning him? No. So anyway, that's rant over for now.
No, the rant is just beginning, because I've got some more questions for you, because I absolutely concur. I mean, I've seen a sea change in basic journalistic rigor, which should be applied without fear or favor, irrespective of who's in power, and irrespective of what's going on. Journalists should be nuisances. They should be asking the kind of questions to give us the data we need to keep us healthy and sane and safe, and not just to propagandize. I mean, you know, I look to countries abroad, such as Belarus or the United States of Russia and countries like that. You know, basically tin pot dictatorships. They operate in this manner, and I sometimes wonder if part of the problem is they are comfortably well off. They're not going to lose their jobs. They're towing the line, and Do you remember the old days when it was the media's job to rigorously cross-examine governments? Where have those days gone, Sue?
I mean, they're still rude to politicians, but they're rude in a kind of ritualistic, non-meaningful way, and they never allow anybody to develop a point. But did you know about you do know about the Offcom regulations that were issued in May, and I think probably this has completely hobbled and crippled all the mainstream media. It says, in particular, we strongly advise you to take particular care when broadcasting, for example, unverified information about the coronavirus. This may include, for instance, discussion of unverified theories for the cause of the coronavirus and discussion of potential treatments or cures for the coronavirus that do not align with advice of the NHS or other public health authorities. I mean, that really puts the kibosh on what they're doing, doesn't it? We would never have had that in my day. The Offcom only started in 2002, but this is this year after coronavirus. And also it says statements that seek to question or undermine the advice of public health bodies on the coronavirus, or otherwise undermine, that word again, people's trust in the advice of mainstream sources of information about the disease. So that's talking about the BBC and the mainstream media mustn't undermine. But I think, you know, what's happened is that our trust as ordinary individuals has been undermined terminally in the mainstream media, in the BBC, where we thought we could turn for impartial, objective, investigative journalism, and it's gone. It's tragic.
You've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. In fact, in episode 1 of Unlocked, when Professor Sikora was on, we had Toby Young, who's the director of the Free Speech Union, and we specifically addressed Offcom. You remember, Eamon Holmes was attacked by Offcom for something he said on ITV This Morning, the same show that Emma Kenny appears on, around 5G masts. You know, it was a throwaway comment. He's allowed to say it, but they were investigated, and it reared the ugly proposition that Offcom is actually a tool of censorship that's being used to make journalists align with government policy. Now, when I say Offcom, I like to put a word, a 4-letter word, beginning with F, before Offcom. I won't say it here because, Sue, I've known you, I've looked at your TV for years. I don't want to offend you, but you get my point. I think this has got to a point where the press is being controlled, and, you know, how will Facebook even react to this broadcast? But what I want to talk about next, Sue, before we move on, another area that you've written about, and I think something, and Alan and John, please, can we do more of these shows where we focus in on specific topics, mental health being an obvious one, cancer treatment another, but something you've spoken about with great passion, Sue, is the care for the elderly. You signed a petition, Rights for Residents. Can you please tell us about what motivated you to get involved in that campaign?
Well, I've seen stories in the media, on Twitter mostly. I've seen stories of people trying to see their elderly relatives, you know, looking through a window, and the elderly relative doesn't know what's going on, or over a wall. I have a 101-year-old mother myself, and I'm really lucky that she doesn't have to be in a care home. She can be at home, and I've been visiting her weekly, and I refuse. I will go to jail rather than not visit her every week. I won't have her ending her days in loneliness because we're supposed to not hug her and not go and see her. I've got another friend who has her mother is also 101. She's in a care home, and she hasn't seen her children or her grandchildren for since March. And she says, she's now saying, oh, well, I don't think, I probably won't see you again. I don't think I'll ever see you again. I'm 101. You don't know how much time you've got left when you're 101, not that much. And the care home won't let them in. And I was, surely it can't be too difficult to work out protocols where you can come and visit and hug your elderly relative. You know, surely you could be tested 5 days beforehand, or there must be ways of being able to do that. I don't believe, and a lot of old people say, look, I'd rather have quality than quantity at the end of my life. I'd rather be happy and see my family. My mother said to me only yesterday, seeing you and my brother and my children and their children, she said, that's kept me alive. I wouldn't be here, she said, if I hadn't been able to see you. And I think that's something that the government has got to address. And if everybody could sign the Care for Residents petition, I'm sure that would help. Just find that online, Care for Residents petition.
I mean, beautifully put. And it's also worth mentioning at this point that a lot of old people have had COVID and have got over it. I mean, my father is 83. He was down the pit for 47 years. So you think, oh, he'll have dodgy lungs. I found out that he contracted COVID. My mum phoned me up and said, you better phone him up. He's not well. And I was like, oh my God. And I was really, really bracing myself for the moment. And I phoned him up and he picked up the phone and he sounded terrible. And I was like, I'd had a couple of drinks. I was so nervous. I went, Dad, are you all right? He went, of course I'm all right. I've been and had 4 pints and got a bag of chips. And I started laughing my head off. I said, oh God. And then I immediately broke down in tears because I was so convinced that this was fatal in an 83-year-old, because I've been told that since the beginning. And by the way, my dad caught it off his partner, Pat, who's 78, who's got a congenital heart condition and has only been kept alive by the miracle of the NHS for years. She also got COVID and bounced back. We never hear about those stories, do we? We
No,
if I could come in for a moment, my mum also, she's a little older than your dad, had COVID this year. And she struggled. The reason I mention it is because the reason that she says she survived is that she very carefully didn't tell any doctors about it and broke the rules by having my sister care for her. And she said it's my sister caring for her that kept her alive through it. And I think that's really important to remember, because we seem to have completely left out of this debate the fact that people caring for each other and the love and affection that's involved in that actually keeps people alive. And I also had, very sadly, the opposite experience, which I can't say very much about because of other members of the family, but another relative died in a care home this year, and she died not of COVID, though I think that was what was put on the death certificate, but she died because she refused food, drink and medication because they were locked in their rooms and they weren't allowed to see anybody. And that's not the care home's fault. Care home staff were wonderful, but it was what the government told them to do. And I think that shows very clearly just how important Sue's campaign is. So apologies for interrupting, but I thought it was important.
No, I don't think you're interrupted. I'm sure Sue won't mind about that, because, you know, I think this whole process of sharing stories and humanizing these debates, I think there's a massive, massive debate and conversation to be had around the critical failure of the government around our elderly and the care home situation. That's something we need to unlock on Unlocked. Let's do that in the future. Sue, all of the stories you hear, the networks you form, let's get them on this show. Let's make the government listen and let's shame them into action, because I think maybe that's the only way. We've got to form the resistance. We've got to unlock all of the ordinary people, the working class communities, the elderly communities, those on the breadline. They need a voice. We can give it to them. The Recovery Project Unlocked, it's been so wonderful tonight just to form these networks and to get going and to let's get tooled up and let's kick on. You know, I feel so excited, and it's meant to be a dark time. You know, in like 4.5 hours, they're going to ring last orders on Britain. I'm going to go for a few beers after this. I guarantee you that. Nothing's going to stop that. So it's been a brilliant, brilliant conversation tonight. And I want to wrap up, if we can, with your personal messages to Boris Johnson and this government. Let's make this from the heart. We're going to make sure they get it. I'm going to go from the top of the show in the order the guests came in, starting with you, John Dobinson.
I think I've just said my life has been touched very directly with people that I love, suffering and also surviving because they've done something the government told them not to do, and coming together as people and showing love, and people dying where the government has had its way and cut them off from the love and support they should have. Right now, the media, the BBC, is not telling those stories. But come next year, what I would ask Boris Johnson to think about is what happens when those two stories are told? What happens when the people who have found they've been diagnosed with cancer too late to get the treatment that could have saved them go on TV and talk about it? What happens when the people who've had someone they loved, a son or a daughter, commit suicide away at university, locked on their own? What happens when those people start to talk about what's happened to them? And Boris is the man who put the policy in place that allowed those terrible things to happen. people are going to start to criticize the government in a way. There's going to be a wave of fury that I don't think this country has ever seen before. Because I think the decision taken today on dodgy data, after we know just how bad the last lockdown was for mental health, for our economy, for so many things, the decision taken today was possibly the most irresponsible decision any government in the UK has ever taken. There will be absolute anger at the politicians who went along with that. And I would say to him, think about that. Think about next year. Think about the anger you're going to face, and think again.
Well put, superb. And just before we move on to Alan Miller, I'd just like to say, let's make this happen. You know, let's make Unlocked recovery. Let's tell those stories. Let's put that evidence before the government. Let's shame them into action. Let's unlock these stories to the public. Let's take it to them. And something positive can come out of these dark hours, I'm sure. Alan, what's your message for Boris Johnson?
You know, when Boris was Mayor of London, we actually did a lot of work together, and we campaigned to have an understanding of the cultural and the social benefits, as well as the economic, of night and day, of the kind of businesses, hospitality, small and large, and the range of different activities that curate the cities that we live in. And similarly, we've done that nationally. And I would really encourage Boris. I would say that he says that Cicero is one of his heroes, and Churchill. Well, Churchill said, let's not repeat the mistakes of the past if you want to learn from them, if you don't want to be doomed to do that. So the first thing is, don't repeat the mistakes of lockdown. Cicero talked about, it shows bravery and to have a resolute spirit, not to be agitated in exciting circumstances, to have courage and virtue, to be able to say, well, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we can come out of this. I mean, Lord knows there's been enough U-turns. It's not like one has to be consistent on a position now. Let's do this because of what's the general common good. You mentioned earlier, actually, in response to Emma and also to Sue, common sense. When Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, it blew the lid off a lot of things. The whole idea of what it means to have freedom, a society where we're all valued and respected one another politically. We've seen a range of measures being imposed, legislation, in terms of what we're allowed to do, being told that if you're together with more than a couple of people, there's going to be all sorts of legal recriminations. In every respect, we've seen how this is decimating in terms of our families, in terms of business. And I would say, to have a contemporary reference, Boris, why don't you do the right thing? Don't have a Groundhog Day. Let's allow courage and virtue to reign. Let's remember that we're fellow citizens. Remember what that means. They're not terrible, despicable people, and that I would really say to Boris, let's have a think about this. There's enough people, even in your own cabinet and backbenchers, that do not agree with this. A lot of people have misgivings. You know, the truth will out. Let's do the right thing together. Let's have some courage and virtue, and let's all handle the areas where they need to be done in terms of care homes and the highly vulnerable, as we should, and get open and get society moving again. It's time for recovery.
Said with pure conviction and passion. And once again, if we could bottle that and put it in number 10, we might have a fighting chance. I want to move on now. Professor Karol Sikora, what's your message for Boris Johnson?
So at the moment, 8% of our 141,000 NHS beds are filled with COVID patients. That's all, 8%. And about 1,000 are in ventilator beds, intensive care. Boris, you've just got to monitor that. You've made the decision, let's go with it. We have to go with it tomorrow, but let's monitor it every Thursday. Let's look at the data. All the predictions are that the NHS is not going to be overwhelmed, that in fact, the rising case numbers are plateauing. Sure, the deaths are going up, that's the last thing. But if you look at the earliest indicators, the number of people phoning 111 or using the King's College Zoe app, you can see something's changed just in the last few days. We are plateauing out of this. Please, every Thursday, sit down and review the data and show us. Don't obfuscate the data in a way the public can't understand. Then we're behind you. Obviously, if we're not going to be able to cope, we have to do something. But my treatise is that we are going to be able to cope. And don't shut the doctors up. Let them speak. Why not? Let's listen to them. The people that are in the treatment side don't believe in this lockdown. The epidemiologists that make up SAGE, they live in the ivory towers. They can do what they like. It's quite convenient for them to impose their will on the people. But the real medics out there think this is just craziness. And I've heard it so many times, but no one's able to speak out. So Boris, please present us the data every 4 o'clock every Thursday to justify continued lockdown.
Well, Professor Sikora, that would seem like a reasonable demand. I mean, why not have transparency? Because that way, if you give information, you give power to the population to keep them safe, to empower them rather than to terrorize them. And as you said, way back in July on Unlocked, brainwashing and terrorizing them. We need to stop that. Emma Kenny, now I'm bracing myself for this one. Emma Kenny, what's your message for Boris Johnson?
Well, it would be for Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock, and all those associated with them. The first thing I would say is the reason that history constantly repeats itself is because people like you underestimate the ordinary working classes. Your arrogance and egotistical beliefs that we are less than you means that you don't see the silent majority or hear their points of view, but I do. And their points of view are telling me that if you do not stop restrictions, if you do not end lockdown, then not just the leadership that you know it will end, but the Tory party will end. Literally, you are desecrating not just the mental health of the whole of the UK, not just the future education for all of our children, not widening just the gap in poverty, but you are actually desecrating the very thing that you stand for, politics as we know it. Right now, all over the UK, people are rising up because they know the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship. And no matter how strong-armed, no matter what rules you create, no matter what lies you spew, and no matter what things that you do, the common person, of which we are many, will never accept the changes that you're intending to make. So you go ahead and power grab, but believe me, there'll be many, many more of us on the other side of the rope, and we'll be much stronger than you when we pull it back.
Emma, Boris Johnson's hero is Winston Churchill. That was Churchillian. I swear to God, if we got you in a political party and got you involved, for the same reasons you were talking there, are the reasons I got involved in politics, when the votes of my communities across Nottinghamshire and the Midlands were completely crushed and they tried to turn it around. I gave up my career. I got stuck in. We did something. We got something done. It feels like revolution is in the air again. And I think you're going to be a huge, huge voice. But before we take over the political structure, before we take over Parliament, please come back on. Let's do some great telly. Because I think this has been brilliant tonight. And I really, really mean it, Emma. I think you can just unlock people's anxiety and depression and mental health via this sort of broadcasting.
With absolute pleasure. That's all I care about. All I care about is the ordinary human being who's struggling. And as you said with Churchill said that most things can be summed up in a word: justice, hope, honour, all of those things, one single word. And what we need now is freedom.
Superbly put. Now, the final word of the night, no pressure, goes to Sue Cook. What would be your message to Boris Johnson, Sue?
I would simply say this is not about abstracts. It's not about data, statistics, numbers, the population. It's about real people, warm, living human beings and their lives. And Boris, would you please just think about ordinary people? Would you put humanity before thoughts of your political legacy?
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in tonight to watch this amazing episode of Unlocked. It's 5 hours before a lockdown, yet I feel strangely inspired. I feel lifted by this conversation tonight. I do think there's hope through unity, through coming together like this. I hope the viewers on Facebook feel the same. We're going to vow to keep this going. If you like what you've seen tonight, please share it across social media. Don't forget the hashtag Time for Recovery. Please follow Unlocked on Twitter, on Facebook. Let's keep this conversation going. Send us in your questions, your stories. We're going to fight for you. We're going to do all we can to unlock this lockdown, to prove that they don't work, they're ineffective, they're damaging, and we're going to form unifications to fight back. So thanks to all of our guests for coming on. I certainly haven't heard a conversation like this in the mainstream media. I feel proud to be a part of it. I hope everybody agrees at home. Thank you for tuning in. We've been Unlocked, and good night.